of a perfect legal tool that has been enshrined in the Marrakesh Agreement that constituted the World Trade Organization. And this inaction kills. As this morning, Manon Aubry, the member of the European Parliament, said in her perfectly brilliant style to the policymakers discussing about the IP waiver and other things at the European Parliament this morning. She was very strong, saying that policymakers are hiding themselves because of shame. She used the word shame so many times. Shame for having allowed vaccines to be private properties despite public funding. Shame for putting no rules on pharmaceutical companies. Shame for allowing the pandemic to become an income generative machine for a few companies and for safeguarding patents and intellectual property rights at all costs, sacrificing people in the global south. So we've lost a long time so far, and this shame is something that I think many of us feel and want to challenge and really want to confront it. Now, some people in this conversation or here attending this webinar may wonder legitimately, but why are you talking about, IP monopoly capitalism if after 7 months, not even this small waiver, this legal waiver has been accepted and introduced by the international community? Well, my immediate answer to this question, which I myself have pondered, is that if it takes 7 months or even more, to maybe not even introduce a waiver, a TRIPS waiver, because the world is actually running against the idea of a TRIPS waiver. Well, then if we want to dismantle the IP monopoly capitalism, we'd better start very soon. And the soon is precisely this moment when all public opinions, civil society organizations, the media, academia is discussing about the ways in which the world has structured knowledge production and the production of science and the management, the economy of science. So this is really the kind of intuition for this conversation today, for this discussion today. And I would like to introduce the speakers quickly. We have here with us today Susan Sell from the University of Australia. We have Mohammed El Said, a lawyer that works with the university also and has supported for a long time member states in their IP policies. We have El Storelle, who is a scientist and a person who has worked, we worked together in MSF, in BNDI. She was with the Open Society Foundation and is now working with the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University College of London. We have Ugo Pagano from the University of Siena. I now quickly give the floor to Marisol for the housekeeping things, and then we start with the conversation. Please, Marisol.
Yes, thank you, Nicoletta. I just wanted to remind everyone that the session is being recorded and that it will be later shared via SID's YouTube channel. Also, just a quick reminder that once we go into the conversation part of the roundtable, participants are welcome to use the raise your hand feature and have the option to turn on your mic and camera. Then you can also write your questions via the chat box. And we also want to invite everyone to follow and contribute to the live conversation via Twitter using the hashtag IP Monopoly, which is right there, and following SID's official Twitter account, which is at @SID_INT. Thank you, and back to you, Nicoletta.
Thank you very much, Marisol. So with no further ado, I would then start with giving the floor to you, Susan, for your 10-minute presentation. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for putting this together and inviting me to contribute to the journal and also to this symposium. And I feel like my responsibility in this role for this roundtable is to really focus on the macro structural features of 21st century capitalism, to think about COVID in terms of those larger structural features and not what we're witnessing at the margin. So I think if we're going to have reform and change, it's going to have to be quite fundamental. So what I want to do today in just a few minutes is look at the global economy from 30,000 feet and try to describe it and the role of knowledge goods within that structure. So can I have the next slide, please? I don't have a lot of slides, so don't worry. So one of the new things I would say about 21st century capitalism is the outsized role of intangibles in contemporary capitalism. So intangibles are things like intellectual property, trade secrets, financial products, and services. So this is the lion's share of power, where power is concentrated in the global economy. And we see the influence of those who own intangibles in the provisions in trade and investment agreements that ask for very strong protection of intangibles, intellectual property protection expansions that we've seen a lot of in resisting the waiver, for example, but also in the free trade agreements, and also in since TRIPS that are much stronger and more demanding than the original TRIPS agreement. And then we're also seeing in investor state dispute settlement a shift where owners of intangibles are claiming that those intangibles, in particular so far in intellectual property, trademarks and patents, that those things are considered to be investment assets. And so what that does is allows the owners of these assets to sue states, as from a private company can sue a state if that state adopts policies that it doesn't like and that might reduce the value of their investment. And we've seen a couple cases that leads to the reduction of policy space for health. One case was in Canada around patents, and the other brought by Eli Lilly. And the other investor state dispute settlement cases that are quite famous are the Uruguay and Australian tobacco cases. But the point about investor state dispute settlement, it really shifts a lot of power to private actors vis-a-vis states and vis-a-vis state regulatory capacity. So it reduces their policy space. Can I go to the next one, please? Thank you. So this, I think, is the most important visual to understand what this big picture looks like. And what's happened over time, this is called the smile curve, and it was invented by the man who founded the Acer computer company. But I think it's extremely useful, and it helps us to understand what's different from the Reagan-Thatcher capitalism of the 1980s and 90s and what we're looking at now. So if we think about the production of a good or a service, or goods and services, you start here, the high value added. That's the research and development, the cost, the intellectual property, coming up with a new product, and then moving down the value added. It's still very lucrative, but design comes next in this pre-production intangible phase. Then you move down to logistics and purchases. At the very bottom here, we have production, which is actually making the good. Think about Foxconn making Apple products. iPhones and whatnot. And then you move back up towards logistics and distribution, marketing. Again, now marketing is moving more into an intangible activity, and then services. And here, another important factor is brand management. So here's where trademarks become very important. You manage the value of your brand. And what we've seen in the 1970s, this broken line, the 1970s, there wasn't a huge difference. The smile was much flatter. And so, you know, those that were working in a company on R&D weren't getting rewarded all that much more than the actual laborers who were making the product. And so the differential between this value added of intangibles and the actual production of things was much flatter, and salaries and things were much less unequal. But what we've seen in the last 20 years, and TRIPS has made this possible, accelerated this trend, is the value added of these intangibles has gone way, way up on both ends of this, whether it's your brand name, your trademark, like Philip Morris was suing over in the tobacco cases, or whether it's the IP, the trade secrets, and the things that are being discussed now in the context of COVID. So the value added has gone much higher here, but at the same time, the differential between production has gotten much steeper on the bottom end. So what we have on the top is more oligopoly power, more economic concentration, more wealth, profit generating. And at the bottom, we have much more competition, very fierce competition to produce things as part of this value chain. And if you think about going back to the Foxconn example, Foxconn makes the iPhone, but gets pennies on the dollar for an expensive product. And at this end, there's a lot of competition to produce and be the supplier for Walmart, or to be able to make an iPhone, things like that. So there's a real difference here. The big difference is inequality, concentration of economic rewards, and reduction of the value added from labor. And so that's a big, big difference. So the intangibles have become, there's outsized role of intangibles in the global economy, and those are the most valuable things to have. They allow you to control these value chains, and we can see this coming to roost in COVID in many different ways, whether it's personal protective equipment, whether it's vaccines, whether it's therapeutics, medical devices. We see the effects of this global value chain and these differentials all through the COVID story. I'd like to move to the next slide. Thank you. So with this outside role of intangibles and a very, very steep smile, what we have is the increased political and economic power of owners of intangibles and those who control these value chains. They can dictate the terms of trade and investment agreements, as we've seen in the FTAs and investment agreements, to shore up this power. So it's a winner takes most system right now, and those who own the intangibles are the winners in this system, big winners, at the expense of many other players. So the next slide, please. Thanks, Marisol. So what I want to say now, what are the multi-level governance effects? That's the 30,000 feet up in the sky. So what does this tell you as we move closer down to the world? At the macro level, we see a big power shift to those who own intangibles, much more economic concentration, even than we had in the 1980s under the neoliberalism of Reagan and Thatcher. We see much more oligopoly and a lot of volatility, and that is based on the outsized role of the financial sector, which has gotten more and more dominant. And we've seen the global financial crisis, but we've seen just so much volatility from the financial sector that has the effects of ruining the real economy. And so those are sort of the macro level story there. Then at the multilateral level, what we see, and these fights over the waiver, I think, are a good example. We see a reduced commitment to social policy in the face of imperatives of finance capitalism, where it's really about profits, it's really about shareholder value. And so economic powers will block social and reform initiatives if they threaten profits and shareholder value. And I think that's a lot of the resistance we're seeing at the WTO right now from Germany and other countries that are just not going along with the waiver, which is very mild, and it's actually, most of it is already allowed in TRIPS, but they're resisting it quite hard. The next slide, please. I think that's my last one. Thank you. And then, oh no, there's one more after this. So, and then at the meso level, I'll be really quick, but what we have is short-term thinking, the reduction of labor power, flexible employment. We've seen so much of that with who is really being harmed in COVID. It's the so-called essential workers who stock the grocery shelves, who work in aged care homes, they are the essential workers, but they're treated very poorly. They're paid poorly. They don't get the protections they need. They're working in the Amazon warehouse. But all of this is a result of that smile curve getting so much steeper that I showed you before. At the national level, we've seen reduced public budgets to address social needs and very sharp income inequality and massive tax evasion. I think Apple paid hardly any US income tax, but when you own intangibles, it's a lot easier for you to claim your profits are earned elsewhere where you don't have to pay as high of taxes. So there's a lot of tax evasion, which is crippling the ability to address things like COVID when you need a healthy public sector with the revenue. And the last slide. Thank you. And so at the micro level, I'll just mention consumer debt is a big problem pretty much everywhere. And there's more efforts to envelop people into the financial system through financial inclusion is really big. There's a lot of predatory lending going on, microcredit initiatives to get people into a debt and finance system of supporting their lives. And then on the everyday level for actual people, what it means is more debt, more private responsibility for your retirement income, your aged care, a lot more fast food consumption because those workers that are being so poorly compensated also don't have time to cook. And so they can buy this very cheap and unhealthy food, which is also part of the bottom of the people at the bottom of that smile curve are consumers of this because that whole industry, which is also controlled by owners of intangibles, especially the brands like KFC and McDonald's, they need a lot of cheap workers to sell 99-cent hamburgers. And those also turn out to be major consumers of the products that they sell that are unhealthy. And then we get unaffordable medicine, health services, deaths of despair, inequality, and poverty. And what we're seeing with COVID is a lot of unnecessary death. And so my takeaway, or why I'm showing you these slides, is to give you the big picture of the structure of the global economy right now and how that is contributing to the mess that we're seeing on the ground with COVID. And so I'm going to end it there and hopefully stuck to 10 minutes.
Yes, you did. You did very well. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thank you for, I mean, I think this black stage of your slides is the kind of the additional, the meta message that you want to convey to us about, you know, the dark picture of this intangible economy that you have tried to represent. And thank you so much for giving really the, not only the smile curve, but the grim of the complex situation and the gloomy situation, which is the mess you tried to represent. Thank you very much. Now I would then give the floor to Mohammed El Said. You have been I mean, all your life has been around IP and the situation produced by IP. You have the floor, Mohammed.
Thank you, Nicoletta. Thank you for getting us all together, and particularly all the panelists, moderators, and viewers. It's an honor to be with you all. I think today we are talking at a crucial moment in time in terms of dealing with IP regulation in general and patent regulation in particular. And I think the time now is right to start raising some questions about the sustainability of the current regime we have. I know the historical argument about patent regime is sustainability and innovation and so forth. However, I think the current crisis is in a way opened wide the doors about the efficiency and efficacy of the current regime, which requires a serious rethinking and requires some thoughtful considerations for the way forward. If please, Marisol, for the next slide. So if we, to summarize the points I want to cover in my 10 minutes, is just again to look at some of the current challenges, which are not new to us, but I think are being made worse with the current situation, and then the need to address these and then the way forward. Next slide, please. So prior to the current situation and the crisis we're currently dealing with in terms of the pandemic, I think there were a number of elements which have already signaled worrying signs about the current public health regime globally speaking. I think the first to look at the increase in the prices of medications that we were dealing with during the past decade, medications which are important to citizens both in developed and developing countries, becoming increasingly unattainable and unaffordable. And treating diseases from hepatitis C to cancer, to so forth. There were already signs that this was not going to be sustainable. And I think in a way, the important shift in this debate is that while historically the debate around access to medicines was more confined to developing and least developed countries or middle and low-income countries, now the debate is actually at the heart of developed countries themselves. And I think the UN high-level panel report clearly indicated that this is now a global crisis rather than a crisis being confined to regions. And I think the other factor here was this, again, the discrepancy in the levels of R&D expenditure, and some of these issues matter to the whole citizens of the world rather than a certain regions or certain types. And that, again, remains a big issue today. We've seen lower investments in antibiotics, lower investments in some of the diseases of the poor as been labeled to and so forth. But I think there are signs maybe that this is about to change recently because of technologies, for example, antibiotics. However, we've seen that there are still major diseases that concern the majority of citizens of the globe that are outside the reach and obviously not developed yet. And I guess the third development coupled with this is that we've seen also an increase in a number of monopolization and a number of patents being claimed, and obviously this is leading to extended terms of protection. That development was also coupled with another worrying evolution of the minimum standards of TRIPS agreement, which was largely triggered by free trade and bilateral investment treaties, which I think also Susan have alluded to. The effect of TRIPS Plus has already been proven to be severe in a lot of countries in terms of evergreening of patents, granting of more patents, and limiting the available policy space to a lot of countries. At the heart of the debate of the TRIPS agreement today, we're looking at the waiver, we're looking about the use of flexibilities. What these TRIPS Plus arrangements have done is actually to shrink the available policy space to a lot of countries, and in fact is undermining the whole existence of the TRIPS agreement itself, which it aimed to a certain extent based on its articles such as Article 8 and so forth, about creating a balance between the rights of the creators and obviously the rights of society, and to achieve its objectives of dissemination of knowledge and encouragement of innovation. So in fact, by the proliferation of these TRIPS Plus arrangements, we've seen that there is an erosion to the policy space, and at the same time, that erosion is going to undermine the TRIPS agreement itself, which we often promote as having an inbuilt mechanism to ensure there is some balance created by all users and stakeholders in the regime. And I think these factors, they were already signaling some crisis for the global health regime. Now we're actually exacerbated and made worse by the emergence of the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, is not the first pandemic humanity is dealing with, and won't be the last. However, our ability in dealing with it and actually having the correct and right mechanisms in limiting its impact will impact how we're obviously going to deal with a future crisis of this nature. And I think that's why this is an important moment of time to try to obtain some clear answers and plan to obtain some clear solutions about how these issues need to be dealt with. Marisol, next slide, please. So what is happening today is, again, I wouldn't say this is the first time in history we're dealing with this challenge. However, we don't seem to be learning also from historical lessons here. The current situation remains as follows. The majority of global citizens are unable to access the vaccines, although the vaccine, obviously, introduction was a major development and a turning point in the fight against this pandemic. However, due to various reasons, the vaccine is yet to actually reach, and the rollout of the vaccine is being slow in a lot of countries, including developed countries, and therefore others are still waiting to get their turn in terms of the supply. And I think the impact of the TRIPS Plus rules we refer to is also making this much more difficult in terms of exercising policy space. These TRIPS Plus rules increasingly limit the granting of compulsory licensing. They encourage second use and third use of patents granting, and they also limit parallel importation and so forth. All these are important tools to try to mitigate the current pressure on the global regime when it comes to accessing medical technologies related and obviously the vaccine to a certain extent. Now, the vaccine supply problem remains a serious problem. I think that is also leading to vaccine nationalism, which is also counterproductive in terms of how the future evolution of this crisis is going to be. If assuming a lot of countries have, let's say in the developed countries, managed to vaccine all these people, the problem remains here is that a lot of other countries who are now being seen as hotspots, for example, are going to develop mutations. And it means that if these mutations keep obviously developing and with cross-border travel in the future keeps going from one place to another, it means that all the hard work being done and invested in these countries will be undone as a result of these mutations. And I think, therefore, it's very important now that a global understanding about and a global priority here in a way about how we want to deal with the vaccine rollout is extremely important. And I've seen a lot of calls by WHO and others to say that there should be an equal rollout of the vaccine, and a lot of governments are perhaps promoting this. However, we are yet to see this obviously at a wider scale, which means a scale that will at least limit any further mutations which could actually have grave repercussions for our humanity. Next slide, please, Marisol. So at this juncture of the debate, I think we really need to start asking questions. Is this current regime sufficient in providing solutions? Clearly, it's not. The human toll of the pandemic keeps rising. I think there will be also an additional toll to be counted after the pandemic somehow, because today we know that there are a lot of countries had to give priority to dealing with the issue of the COVID treatment, while others who have probably long-lasting and more even serious medical conditions are unable to get treatment, as those in hepatitis C and those in the cancer, for example, and so forth, because they're again being given sort of a second-line treatment because of the priorities to deal with the vaccine. And I think in the long run, the human toll of this obviously pandemic would unfortunately be much bigger than we were looking at today. The figure today is around 3.5 million from what I've seen, but I think this number is probably going to be on the rise as long as something is done quite soon about particularly the new mutations of the COVID-19. Marisol, please, if you click a couple of yeah. So I think it's the right time to start raising questions here about, is the current patent regime sufficient in dealing with the situation we have? I think there will have to be a serious consideration to how the patent regime should be modified in the future to actually to cater for the needs of populations, particularly when dealing with such large scale, obviously pandemics and regional diseases even to a certain extent. I think the further emphasis should be is to normalize the use of flexibilities. I mean, despite all the work that's been done in the past 2 decades of the promotion of use of stretched flexibilities and enabling of many governments and legislators to have these flexibilities, we can still see that their use has been quite limited in a lot of countries. And I think there is this sort of a stigma about the use of flexibilities because they've attracted either criticism from other countries or from interest groups, or because there was not enough understanding about the utilization of these flexibilities. And I think an important issue to look at and should be addressed quite soon is that there should be an end to TRIPS plus obligations. In fact, what seems to be reasonable is that we should revert back to the standards of TRIPS agreement, since there is a consensus at least about the importance of these standards with their flexibilities. Scaling back to these standards at the moment would be the reasonable thing to do, as this is going to actually ensure a better balance created by all for the interests of all. Again, alternative models of innovation is gaining more ground recently, but is yet to see more, I would say, a structured approach, an institutional approach, and I think there should be more discussion around this. And I think the waiver has been discussed by Susan and Nicoletta, is indeed a very good idea, but it does not solve our problem. I mean, the waiver is dedicated to deal with the pandemic only, with the COVID-19. But there are other important medical conditions and diseases that many today are still suffering from, which needs consideration. And I think this is a temporary waiver I think one of the positive signs to look at is the shift in the US position here, which was something I think welcomed by many, to start considering even the idea of a waiver, which was not obviously echoed in the past. However, again, this should be also another issue that should be taken into consideration. And I think the collective effort in dealing with this pandemic remains important today. Rather than focusing on national priorities, I think there should be a global one, because whatever is happening in one place is certainly affecting others. And I think the way forward is to have a collective discussion, debate, and understanding about the way forward. I would stop here to limit with my 10 minutes, and thank you so much, Nicoletta.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you. Of course, you concentrated a lot on medicines and drugs. I would also, however, broaden the scope. Here we're talking about seeds also. We're talking about the production of so many other things. And I think the question of, anyway, the system, the economy of knowledge, and the fact that much of this innovation is produced to work through public funding and with a lot of support from governments is actually the issue that I would like to address and hand over to Els Torelli, asking her also to respond to many of the questions that the scientific community, the narrative arguments of the scientific community, that you cannot actually promote innovation unless and until you have intellectual property rights. Please, Els, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with this fantastic audience, and I look forward also to some more interactions in the end. So maybe Marisol, if you can just hold on for a second, because I have a few slides that I only want to put up when I talk about it. And also because many of the audience have asked to see our faces as we talk, so I'm happy to talk and see you too, rather than stare at a few slides. So what I will be doing is actually look through the specific lens of vaccines. I mean, everybody is today talking about vaccines, of course, but looking, I've had the privilege during most of 2020 to be in a position of a sabbatical that allowed me to actually observe and study and analyze quite extensively what has happened at the level of the research and development efforts towards new vaccines, and then how that was supposed to be connected to access, but as we all know, has kind of gotten lost in translation to a certain extent. And if you can put just briefly the first slide, Marisol, just to give you a sense, and this has resulted in that paper that I contributed to the development special issue that brought us all together. But I've been writing a few other things, blogs and other short pieces that actually all look through the microscope of the vaccine R&D and access. Yes, thank you. Through what I think is the topic of today, the monopoly capitalism. And so I want to use these 10 minutes to share with you some of my key observations, but you can find more if you Google some of these articles. Thank you, Marisol. So I think the first observation that we have to say is that it has been a formidable achievement that in less than 1 year since the emergence of this virus, we have multiple vaccines that are available, shown to be safe and effective enough to actually start using, and massively. This is amazing. However, as we know, there is also, in terms of access, there is an extreme inequity. The way that we are now deploying the vaccines is creating even more inequality than we have ever had. And I mean, just to give you a few figures, if you're not familiar with them, we have today distributed or administered over 1.5 billion doses of vaccines, and 75% of those went just to 10 countries. And if we go to the extreme of the whole continent of Africa, which is 1.35 billion people, less than 25 million vaccine doses have, until a few days ago, have been administered. So this is an extreme inequity, and for which we are currently, many people are paying the price, and I fear it might get worse. Just to cite a good friend and activist from South Africa, Fatima Hassan, who noted 2 days ago that Desmond Tutu, 80 years old, important public figure, received finally his dose of vaccine, while in countries like the US, the UK, etc., kids with very little risk for having severe disease or dying are being vaccinated. And the situation in South Africa is really terrible. They have confronting a serious pandemic, but with very few vaccines until now to actually even start vaccinating their health workers. So why are we in this situation? The reality is that despite having these vaccines, we don't have enough doses of vaccines. So that's the first thing. There is a limited amount of doses available, which in a second case are also distributed inequitably. You may remember that a year ago when we started talking about developing vaccines, and it looked as if it was going to be faster than anticipated, there were calls to make the vaccines available equitably for everybody. Calls for a people's vaccine were being raised. There is an allocation framework that the WHO has been asked to develop that was meant to be in a way that every country would first be able to vaccinate their most vulnerable, their healthcare workers, and then gradually we would all kind of vaccinate more and more. We have seen that wealthy countries have completely rejected that once the vaccines were available, leading to the extreme inequality that we see now. But why are we getting there? The reason is that we have monopolies, and then we come to the topic of this debate. We have monopolies on knowledge. Knowledge, we often talk about patents, intellectual property rights, but it's much broader than that. The knowledge monopolies are also, for instance, and very starkly around production capabilities, production technologies. There too, we have hoarding, and take that together with the hoarding that we have seen by wealthy countries creating even more monopolies by buying up most of the available stock. We have monopolies on monopolies that have led to the situation that we're in. I want to backtrack a little bit to kind of think about how did we actually get there. And if you see a year ago, or I mean, in January, when the sequence of the virus was first published, you had a precipitation of many scientists, public and private sector, that utilized existing vaccine technology to rapidly adapt to integrate that new virus. We have the different organizations and companies working around these adenoviral vectors. University of Oxford, they had been working on that technology for the past 15-20 years, trying it out for malaria, for MERS, for Zika, for a number of infections. They just adapted what they had and added another thing that came from public research, namely the fact that we already knew that coronaviruses, the way the immune system reacts, that this famous spike protein would be a good candidate to raise vaccines again. So everybody did exactly that, used their vaccine technology existing and adapted it to create immunity against the spike protein. The mRNAs that everybody says like, wow, this is a major breakthrough. Yes, this is the first time we have mRNA vaccines, but it's been the result of 20 years or plus of basic research and technology development efforts, mostly in academia, mostly supported by public research, that then, as of January, was adapted to coronavirus and further developed, and indeed this time delivering a vaccine. The same we can say for some of the other technologies. The point what I'm trying to make is that basically, why did we have these vaccines so fast? First, because we built on existing knowledge and technology, mainly by previous public research, basic research, massively publicly financed, and the fact that there were then massive public subsidies going through these developments. Again, and Operation Warp Speed, I think it was $12 billion through 5 or 6 developers. The European Union has invested, Germany, the UK, etc. So all of that was massively de-risking what then meanwhile had become owned by the developers, which were all private companies. And then this is where the extractive way in which the intellectual property system functions, that in the end, despite having 20 years of research and development efforts of many different people, somehow we end up having these vaccines being owned by single companies. 5, 6, 7 single companies, but everybody has actually been able to capture through the way our IP system functions the results of all that previous research, and again, despite much public subsidies previously and over the past year that went into that. Maybe can you quickly put on the second slide, just as an illustration about, there is a very nice paper that was published in Nature Biotechnology in the last couple of weeks, mapping the patent landscape for mRNA vaccines. And so mapping also the connections between all these different, both universities and academic institutions and companies, to show what a complexity of knowledge is all being put behind these technologies, but that are today the sole owners of monopoly players, whether it's BioNTech together with Pfizer or Mrna, that, as we know, are now staunch defenders of not sharing the technology further. And so in the end, what we get is actually we get a competition between multiple monopolies to develop vaccines for taking on this pandemic. And one thing that I've been writing quite a bit about is also how the fact that we are using the market competition to deliver vaccines actually is not good for public health. And we can drop the slide again, thank you. So for instance, what we saw is that these vaccine companies, they were competing for speed to get marketing approval or emergency use authorization ASAP. And what we saw is that the choices of the type of products that were developed, for instance, or the type of clinical trials that were done, the design of the trial was totally focused on getting there as soon as possible, meaning to be able to sell the vaccine as soon as possible, rather than thinking what it is that we need for public health and to curb the pandemic. A good example there is, of course, the Pfizer vaccine, the first that we got, that needs to be kept at -70, -80 degrees. There is CureVac, who's also developing an mRNA vaccine, but that who have taken the time to adapt it to be able to be used at fridge temperature or transported, which will be much more easy to use, but it has taken a little bit more time. And now they're punished because they are actually much behind Pfizer. And what we see today is that, I mean, countries where the health system is so fragile already, they only they get these vaccines that they need to be stored at -80. They don't have the capacity. It adds a significant cost to the deployment effort. So these vaccines are not suitable for wide use, but because it was a race for the first, that is what we have. And I mean, Europe just bought 1.3 billion doses of the Pfizer vaccine, and it's like, wow, all the others have actually lost their opportunity. The other thing about the trial design, and I'm going to shorten a little bit because I'm running out of time, is maybe to say that while what we wanted and needed from the start is vaccines that would cut the disease severity and mortality, because that was our health systems were overwhelmed with people in ICUs, people were dying. That was the primary goal of vaccine development. However, the trials, in their effort to go fast, were measuring not whether they protected against severe disease or death, but only against milder disease. Now, we were lucky that in the end, the efficacy was so high that even though we measured in the trials only protection against mild disease, that they ended up protecting as well against severe disease and death. but that was not a given in the end. That's what we learned afterwards. And I say we were lucky, but the design of the studies was again not geared for public health or for how can we best curb the pandemic, but how can we get a product out there that we can sell. Finally, maybe a few more words on the governments through they've subsidized massively, but also de-risked, especially through these pre-market, the advanced market purchase commitments, or how do you say that again? The fact that they actually decided to buy massive amounts of vaccine, even before the vaccine's safety and efficacy was shown. This is the total de-risking of the pharmaceutical business model. And this is the reason the risk taking is always taken as the reason why monopolies are granted, high prices can be charged, etc. But in this case, there was no risk taking. There was very limited risk taking. All the risk was taken over, even through liabilities by governments. Still, we have allowed the patents and the monopolies to be maintained. So now, I mean, they have it all. They have the monopolies. They have no risk. They have not been. They did not need to invest, but they have the whole business. And I think we, as the public, the citizens, I think we are on the losing end double. One final thing is maybe towards projecting towards the future, and I'm going to round here. Maybe if I can have the last slides, Marisol. There are ways forward that are being projected, and I want to highlight here the report of the independent panel that was commissioned by the World Health Assembly that recently presented their report. It was the independent panel for the review of the pandemic response, and they have the one section that has gotten very little attention actually speaks about the way we have done innovation. And I think it's really important to highlight what they say. They say, well, so far what happened is that there was a lack of shared vision that therapeutics, vaccines, and diagnostics should be considered global health commons. Very important, they put forward that we need to consider these as global health commons. And in their recommendation, they clearly say that we need to shift from a model where innovation is left to the markets to a model aimed at delivering global public goods. And I think that that is a really important turning point if we can make that indeed into reality. And then maybe one final comment here is that I was very heartened by a meeting that the WHO recently organized, a scientific forum to look at progress on the scientific side of the COVID, all the COVID things, and where the frustration of the scientists in the room, the virtual room, and there were hundreds of participants, was so tangible because they, for the first time, I think, realized that all the work, they've been working day and night for more than a year to do all different vaccines, diagnostics, epidemiology, all of that. And then realizing that despite all their efforts and despite all the progress that we've made, that we're confronted with this highly unequal, unequitable situation. And I think there was something like they want to see change. And I think that this is a constituency that we've been lacking in the movement, to have the scientists with us to say, no, we need to make sure that all our efforts result in equitable access. I'll leave it there. Sorry,
thank you, Else. Thank you very much. And please, those that participate, do mute your microphones. So 25 years after the WTO, we are in a situation of knowledge feudalism that has been clearly the diagnosis. The situation that in 1999 was related to the Global South has now extended as a problem of drugs prices, for example, or seed ownership to the entire world. We are packed with TRIPS Plus agreements that make the situation even more breathless in a way. They take our breath away even more than when the TRIPS agreement was negotiated and introduced. And therefore, we are really, I mean, in that respect, I think COVID-19 and this question of, affecting the respiratory tract of our body calls us for liberate ourselves from this lack of oxygen and asks us to be mobilized for really overcoming this IP monopoly capitalism. And therefore, Ugo Pagano, since you were the one who has studied and defined so well this claustrophobic and dystopic scenario that we are in, I'll give you the floor now to give us also a bit of a projection for the way forward that Else already has put for the discussion from the scientific point of view, from the science community point of view. Thank you, Ugo.
Thank you for organizing this meeting, Nicoletta. I think it is very important that we discuss these issues because framing is the crucial problem in this situation, framing and ideology. Let me quote a very beautiful passage from Susan Sell's book, Private Power, Public Law, the Globalization of Intellectual Property Rights. This was a book written in 2003 and is still a very good reference if you want to understand how we got to this situation. She says, historically, patent rights were considered to be grants of privilege. Over time, this notion has given way to the notion of property rights in intellectual goods. Now, this language, she observes, is not neutral. Why? Because the language of rights weighs in favor of the person claiming the right. The language of privilege weighs in favor of the person granting the privilege. So we have had a big change. If you consider an author like Schumpeter, you can never find in Schumpeter, the main author, the main authority about innovation, the word intellectual property right. It had not yet been invented, okay? It is an invention that came later. So the way in which the problem has been framed has been through an analogy between property and something that is completely different, that is a monopoly right, okay? And of course, the change has been very important. And about the waiver, the framing of the waiver is very bad. You know, it's a good thing that everyone is discussing about the waiver, and it's possible now that the waiver gets through. But the way in which the issue is framed is really very unsatisfactory. For instance, in a very beautiful article by Amy Kapczynski, she shows how we have had an organization of influenza vaccines through time for the seasonal flu through open science. And there has been a flu network organized by university departments. And there was a coupling of open science and open market. So in this respect, it looks like we are trying to change a system of established intellectual property right with a waiver. It is the other way around. There is an assault of this new model of capitalism in these areas. And so even vaccines that traditionally were the flu vaccine that were supplied in a different way, now, thanks to this investment in mRNA, that's, as Else has so well said, were really done with public money, now they want to change the entire organization and base it on closer science and closer market instead of open science and open markets. And it's a very inefficient type of organization. What Else has said in her article, what we need is, in this case, collective intelligence, not the segmentation of different efforts. And we need, especially with the variance labs from all over the places, cooperating with each other and allowing each person to, each possible person that is capable to participate also in the production process. So we can really talk about this intellectual monopoly capitalism as a virus. And the last thing that it has infected is vaccine production, as it is the title of this meeting. But let me say, even if we accept that intellectual property is property and not a monopoly privilege, still, having done this analogy, when we consider traditional property about standard goods, we know that in some cases we have procedures for expropriation. If you have to build a road, an important infrastructure, you would expropriate the houses that are an obstacle to this type of enterprise that you are trying to do. And why we cannot have the same thing for intellectual property? So from this point of view, the waiver should not be an exception. The word that has been used by members of the American administration is that the waiver is an exceptional measure for exceptional circumstance. The other way around, it should become routine. Whenever there is a problem for which the private property, if you want to use this language instead of monopoly, of a piece of knowledge is an obstacle for further research, for important purpose, for health, it should be expropriated in the same way in which you do it for a house. And let me say that there are additional reasons, of course, to do that, because it's a monopoly privilege. But the other way to think about it is that when you expropriate the house, it may be a nice house, the house is gone and you get the road. Here, it's completely different. You expropriate the knowledge of the guy is still there, and other people can use also the knowledge, okay? What we are dealing about is that somebody not only had a house, but had also the privilege to stop others from building other houses, okay? So when we get rid of this privilege, we can also favor the relaunch of the economy, because the former monopoly happens to have now more money because he will get some compensation for the expropriation and more competition, so you should invest more. And also the other would invest more. So the argument that these waivers and these expropriation procedures are a bad thing is not really something that is well founded. Now, why intellectual monopoly capitalism is really a big virus for society? I think for two important reasons. The first one is the inequality that it generates. We have firms in a virtuous circle. Because you have intellectual property, you basically own some development path for technology. You invest in skills and capabilities, and you get even more intellectual property rights. Others are in a vicious circle. They lack the intellectual property rights, and if you lack the intellectual property rights, you are not going to invest in skills that are useless because you are not allowed to follow a certain technological path, and you never get the intellectual property rights. So vicious circle and vicious circle are so strong that even if you take only the American economy, and so without considering globalization, all the race in inequality can be explained as a race in inequality among firms, not within firms, okay? Because you have firms, you know, in vicious circles and some in virtuous circle. Of course, if you expand the analysis, as Els was saying, to other countries, or I think it was Susan that was saying that, then you have that really, you know, the iPhone is really built in Taiwan or in China. They get very little money, and you get this value chain that only the firm that owns the first part and the last part of the chains get all the profits. The second thing is that intellectual monopoly capitalism leads to what many economists have called secular stagnations. By the way, explaining this secular stagnation in terms of intellectual monopoly capitalism is, I believe, a much better explanation than alternative explanation, because it explains two things: the boom of the 90s, the roaring 90s, and the stagnation that you had later. Why? Because property rights, intellectual property rights, the enforcement of intellectual property rights has two effects. One effect is immediate. You rush to get the rents. So immediately you get a boom in terms of investments and just to try to get the rents. But then there is a blocking effect. The more you colonize knowledge, the more risky all investments become. So this type of effect prevails later on, and you get in a very difficult situation. Now, what to do with respect to this? The first thing to do is that we need the waiver to become a standard procedure at the WTO. Expropriation of pieces of private pieces of knowledge that are an obstacle for important purposes should become routine, and there should be a court where you can appeal whenever there is this strong blocking effect. That is a very important reform. The second reform that I think is also very important is that we have got a very unbalanced system. Why? Because we have got strong private property rights for knowledge and no global state. Of course, we cannot create a global state, but we can say that if a country is using the knowledge that is produced as public knowledge by other countries and is over-privatizing its own knowledge, is free-riding on somebody else's knowledge, and is also doing some unfair competition. And this unfair competition is bad for everyone. So if you want to participate to the WTO, there should be a minimum level of investment in open science that each country should have. If you don't do that, you are free riding on others, you are doing unfair competition. So I think that these reforms are important, and this is a moment not just to have a waiver, but to try to reform the WTO and the global system by which knowledge is produced. Thank you.
Thank you, Ugo. Thank you so much for this very, projecting scenarios. And since we now have about 20 minutes, I really would like to give our participants the floor. There are already interesting questions coming out. Some of them are here. Yes, the first one that I want to, it's addressed to Susan Sell. What do you, Susan, think about the significance of the TRIPS waiver talks happening within the WTO? The institution historically built, of course, to safeguard intellectual property. This is a question coming from Preeti Patnaik, she's the editor of Geneva Health Files. There was another question, maybe from question, yes, for else. Yusuf Hamid said recently that vaccines, being biologicals, have a very different level of difficulty than drugs, which are largely based on synthetic chemicals. How easy or difficult is it going to be to actually produce vaccines in the global south if the waiver goes through? There is a third question, and then of course I ask people to, you know, express their questions in person, so not in writing. Do you think that the WHO approval of Sinopharm and its potential entry into COVAX could be a game changer? May I ask you to be bolder than, you know, just think a bit, not just about the situation of the vaccines and the waivers, but really take on what Ugo Pagano has just invited us to do, you know, be really more thinking about reforms and important reforms. Thank you very much for your question. So Susan, you have the first, Els and others who may want to respond to the others, and I'm actually inviting other people to take their floor, please.
Okay, thank you for the question. And I'd like to say that I think the WTO waiver is insufficient. The forum is too small. It's too narrow, really, to address the kind of problems that I'm talking about. And like Ugo was saying, I think we need a much bolder approach. But I would say, keep talking, keep working on the waiver. It's a big deal that the US finally said, you know what, even super narrow version, they have not said anything like this since, you know, the TRIPS began. So this is a big deal. And if anything has potential to change the way we've been doing it, it's got to be COVID. You know, back in the HIV/AIDS thing, I thought this is going to change everything. No, it didn't. But this one, it knows no boundaries, it knows no borders, it knows no class, it mutates. You know, it's an existential threat. So, you know, I think it's got the potential, but I think, you know, we have to rip a lot of things up from the roots and not just focus on the waiver and the vaccines, but, you know, executive compensation for pharmaceutical executives. It should not be based on share buybacks. And following from the excellent work by William Lazanik and Maria Mazzucato, we have to really realign the public and private. Right now, the private gets all the rights with none of the obligations. What we really need to do is change that balance so that the private sector has obligations. That part of it's been removed with the de-risking that Els was talking about. Also, we need to balance, as Mazzucato and Lazanik talk about, the risk and reward. When you're de-risking and putting all this taxpayer money into these innovations, taxpayers are paying twice for it, and at a very steep price. When you have to buy it back from the private actors, even though your money created the mRNA technology. So I think there's a lot of really fundamental shifts that we're going to need to push for. Another one is to reinvigorate antitrust, or what is called in Europe competition policy, because what we're seeing right now is abuses of monopoly power. And, you know, whether it's the tech sector, whether it's Monsanto with the seeds, whether it's, well, Bayer now, or whether it's drugs. I mean, we need to find a way to check these abuses of monopoly power. And under the, you know, Reagan-Thatcher thing, they took the teeth out in the Chicago School of Economics. They took all the teeth out of antitrust enforcement. But I think the time is ripe for a broad conversation, and many governments are looking at big tech as particular targets for this. But I think that conversation could be made much broader than tech, and especially looking in the domain that we're all working on here in terms of health outcomes. So you know, what I also would agree with Ugo is, you know, what he said, publicly important goods, that knowledge should be expropriated. I really think we need a different system for what we might call foundational goods. And those I think of as seeds, what we need to live on, medicines and medical technologies that help us to live or stay alive, and educational materials. We need health, we need nutrition, and we need education. So those three things I think need to be ring fenced or treated in a different way than they're treated now. I think the damage is particularly severe in those areas when access is not available. So I'll just leave it there, but there are a lot of different regulatory reforms, or a lot of different places we can be putting our energies, but I would urge very strongly to tackle some of these bigger structural pictures too. But at the same time, I don't want to say that the health activists are wasting their time, because they're not. I think we all have to march forward at, as I showed you, it is manifested so many different levels. We have to really address all of them. And so we should pick the ones we think we could be most efficacious at and go forward. But we need a full court press at this point, with scientists, as Els pointed out, with the intellectual monopoly capitalism, as Ugo points out, with the vaccines and medical devices that Mohammed's talking about. So, I mean, we need all of this. And I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think the waiver is the shoe to keep the door open, actually. We need it to have it there and actually
That's
try
important.
to absolutely fundamental. No one is questioning this at all. Please, Els, and I have in the meantime other questions coming on board, but you started with the ones that I allocated to you already. Thanks.
Yeah, and maybe I've answered in part a little bit already in the
please, I ask you to be.
But maybe one thing, I think one challenge that we have is indeed balancing. We are in the middle of a crisis, of a major health crisis. I mean, what we hear from India, from Brazil, from other regions. So there is an urgency to act now. And of course, I mean, all the reforms that we're talking about here, they're not going to happen tomorrow, but we need to start also today. We also can't fall into the trap to say, well, let's first solve the crisis now, because then the momentum will be gone, etc. That's why the waiver as a foot in the door is really important in a political momentum. But I think we need to be careful, certainly if we talk about the vaccines, not to get trapped into a lot of the resistance against the waiver, even though most is ideological and political, but there is also like, it's not going to be fast enough. But I think that we need to keep in mind the only way in which we can do something fast is redistribute existing doses. There is nothing about scaling up production, whether it's by the big pharma or whether it's through the waiver by companies in developing countries. None of that is going to be fast enough to address the urgency that we have now to reallocate doses. And I think that we should, as a health community, push very strongly, because we don't dare to say that aloud in our countries, to say, well, actually, we shouldn't be vaccinated because there are people dying, healthcare workers more vulnerable in other countries. I think we should start pushing back on that and not give our governments the leeway to do what they're doing, is completely rejecting any fair and equitable allocation framework, because this is where the solution for tomorrow lies. And anything about, well, it's not going to be fast enough to scale up manufacturing is true, but that's not the solution for tomorrow. That's a solution for next year. And there, I think we need to also be clear, in a year from now, if you see how much was done over the past year, if we start today, in a year from now, we can do massive amount of manufacturing by other partners. And there, again, it's important, we need not to fall into the same monopoly situation. If we just allow the companies to scale up their production, and then in a year from now, we're back in the same situation, we may need new doses, new booster shots, etc. And then the developing countries will still be waiting at the end of the line. So this is why we need to kind of go for scaling up manufacturing independently of the monopolies, because otherwise we are never going to get out. And then connecting with other movements, I think, Susan, you made a very strong point. This is, and also Ugo, this is one element of a much broader monopoly capitalism. And maybe one final point to make here, you may be interested to know that there is a new WHO council set up for the economics of health for all, chaired by Mariana Mazzucato. So I hope that we can actually drive some of that ideas that you were mentioning about financialization, about risk rewards, the role of the public sector, of states in shaping the innovation, etc. That hopefully, as an idea of having economic policy with as a goal, is improving health outcomes, not the other way around. So that's some sliver of hope.
You're on mute.
You're muted.
Sorry. No, I just would like to extend, stretching to other questions that I would maybe ask Mohammed and Ugo. For example, Mario Pianta is asking, yes, these arguments are all very strong, but where are the governments, where are the political and social forces that can actually, be our interlocutors in this very important, crucial fight, and what alliances can be formed? Also, another question from Yanis Lasnis: to what extent are we not witnessing a new strategy for neo-colonial dominance through the vaccines monopolies? That's pretty much what we are seeing. And the third question, beyond civil society and academia, who are the handful of public and private actors that could be engaging in the catalyst, as catalyst for the major system change? This is Anne-Marie Sevcik. And where are the folks that actually can produce this change? I mean, please, Mohammed, I give you the floor. Yeah. Please be brief.
All, of course, I mean, all valid questions. And I think we need to in a way be creative on how we find solutions to these questions. I think, first of all, we need to remember that we don't have two groups fighting over discussion today. We don't have two unified positions. It's not like the developing countries are fighting against developing. You can see now it's becoming more complex, where even some developed countries are considering options which are closer to the point of view of developing countries and the other way around. And I think the starting point would be awareness. Civil society role remains vital in bringing a more unified position, at least to these developed countries and developing countries who form majority in a lot of organizations today, to be able to put a clear agenda forward. And I think that's still lacking today, because we see that there's a fragmented position from these countries on all these issues. And I think that's an important dimension to look at. But also, we need to be creative in identifying lobbyists who actually have an interest in what we're talking about. I think perhaps some of the insurance companies will feel that the medical prices of medicines in the US particularly been often referred to as an interesting group to look at, because they're also suffering as a result of this monopoly regime, which is forcing them to pay millions and billions of dollars over repayments and so forth for the prices of medicines, which are overpriced from that point of view. So I think we need to start activating these kind of networks and start reaching out, but with clear as well plans. I think there is a need to think in a corporate way rather than just keep things at a simple way, an academic way, to be able to go and actually gather more and more support and bring more alliances that will have an influence in bringing these ideas forward.
Thank you, Mohammed. Ugo.
Well, I think that we can find alliances. The important thing is that we make an effort to frame things in a different way. So, for instance, is to talk about the fact that you should have open science. Otherwise, not only you are free riding, but you're doing unfair competition. The language of unfair competition can be acceptable, in a very, very wide spectrum of people. It's something that, and the other thing that we should try to stress is that we need that states, that is possibly also an answer to Pianta. I think that there is at the moment some ideology against state intervention, state funding of things and so on. Although this has changed a bit with the pandemic, but we can, I think, do something by showing that there is some link, some strong complementarity between public intervention, open science, and open markets. Because take, for instance, the flu network, as has been working up to now, for seasonal flu. They basically do not even disclose which one is the new variant, to anybody, because they don't want to give any unfair advantage to any particular company. So all the companies then can easily compete. So there is really a link between the fact that we have got all these labs cooperating together in the world. They do not only understand which one is the next variant of the virus, they also look at the way in which the virus can be reproduced faster, and they suggest it to companies. Then they disclose it to everyone. And there you see a very virtuous complementarity between open science and open markets. So, but I think that if it becomes, you know, something that is for open markets and open science instead of closed market and closed science, again, the language is very appealing because nobody wants to disclose things in the end. So we have to make a lot of meetings and a lot of reframing, you know. Up to now, through the language of property, they've been winning, but we have tried to overcome this problem.
Thank you very much, Ugo, for talking about the reframing thing and the need to reuse the language and you know, reconceptualize the whole matter with strong and important new linguistic devices, because I think we have been so trapped, and in many ways, even civil society organizations have interiorized this monopoly regime, this privatization regime that I can tell you, I mean, I'm really concerned when we talk about the waiver, I bump into a lot of my colleagues having to always say temporary, because they want to be reassuring the counterparts that this is not going to be a revolution. This is going to be a temporary measure, always associated with the catastrophe of COVID, as if we could not see ourselves beyond, you know, the pure emergency humanitarian approach. And we should not be thinking about something that really requires new rules, requires a new system, because where there are monopolies, you know much better than me, there is no market. There is no market. Monopoly is the most anti-market arrangement that you can have in many ways. And in fact, that's what, you know, this lack of breath is leading us to. Anyway, we are coming to a close, and I really want to thank you all. I'm sorry that we cannot respond to the important issues, questions that have been raised, but I hope we will be able to come back to you through, you know, taking up your comments and formulating some answers to your questions or comments made, even through the speakers, because I know these are people that are really very, very dedicated and very available people to engage in this conversation. I take Ugo's invitation to have more conversations of this, to engage more into this conversation, this type of conversations. I want to very much thank Susan for having done something that not always happens, representing to us these kind of metaphysical intangibles. I worked as a board member of a bank, and I know that there are my colleagues in this chat, and we have always discussed quite a bit on how the intangibles represent a major menace for the financial system, for the, you know, for a financial justice systems in the world. So I think we also need to go beyond the mere trade question, and as you did, also present all the financial and the power disequilibrium that this situation produces. I also want to thank you particularly for having introduced this notion of the foundational goods. I think it's it's absolutely great expression. I also want to thank Mohammed for having reminded us how the kind of situation we are in, this feudalism in which we are in, is very associated to nationalism, which is, yes, vaccine nationalism, but it is actually the expanding nationalism and possibly the outcome also of this crisis, as we see that the dysfunctional system we live in is actually, you know, leading us in the wrong political direction, and not to an open, progressive outcome of the lessons learned of COVID, rather quite the opposite. And I want to thank, of course, Else for reminding us that this science production is not working properly, is never actually been particularly efficient in the past. We see that a monopoly creates dysfunctions, but it has been particularly non-promising in the case of COVID, notwithstanding the acclaimed results of the vaccines, because COVID tells us how the public health glance, the public health perspective requires a different approach. Now it's kind of silly that we should adapt a totally elitarian vaccine to resource poor settings. We should be doing exactly the other way around. We should be really looking at the benchmark of public health reasons in order to create a vaccine. And I, once again, want to thank Ugo for this issue of the reframing. I think we really need to reframe the problem, and we really need to reconceptualize the situations. Otherwise, we end up a little bit as it is happening today with the COVAX experience, that we are in a way calling international cooperation a kind of a merchant bank system that is actually, with the public funding, supporting the hoarding by the richer of the vaccines that are officially, produced for the poor. And in fact, we have all accepted that whereas for rich countries, the kind of safety measures should be immunization for 70% of the population, we have enshrined in the COVAX that for the poor countries, 20% of the population is enough. So, this is, I think, a real institutionalization of an apartheid mechanism and of a health apartheid that it's totally unacceptable. And I think this is really my final consideration. I think we are at a kind of a fracture point at the moment, and this battle is very symbolic in many ways. Whether we can call ourselves humans still, or we are really entering kind of, lightheartedly a post-human, or rather an inhuman time, where we kind of seem to digest and dilute a lot of things that maybe 50 years ago we would have never, ever accepted, because we had a stronger political culture. We had a strong ideals to believe on that we are now kind of dropping in the name of pragmatism, of maybe to some extent also a certain Cinderella syndrome that civil society organizations have, to be at the good rooms, to be in the nice, events, and to participate, because co-optation of civil society organizations is also, unfortunately, one of the downsides of a mechanism of accumulation of power and a lack of balance, lack of checks and balances in the power interplay. So I really wish to thank you all. I think this is really, for me, a beginning. Now in my position as Society for International Development, I want to do more of this. I know that some of the speakers want to do more of this. I know that some of the listeners want to do more of this, and we will do more of this. We have nothing to lose. And that's what my African friends have taught me. When you have nothing to lose, you're in a perfect position to really engage in the courage of daring. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Else. Thank you, Ugo. And thank you all for being here. We have shared the articles and the whole actually December issue of Society for International Development. We will have more dedicated to biotechnology that are coming in the future. And I really appreciate your being with us until now. We are actually stretching the time, and let's get together again. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nicoletta.
Bye. Goodbye.
Brava, brava.
Brava, Nicoletta.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.